Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Tommy. Today, I'm gonna show you how I built this 9-inch drill-powered disc sander with built-in dust collection. Whether it's your first time here, or even if you've been here before, welcome to 1 Minute Workbench. So this disc sander is actually the third iteration I've built since I started this project. The first two just weren't performing the way I wanted them to. So I kept tweaking the design until I came up with one that was an easy, simple build, yet still had really great performance. I used Baltic birch plywood for this project, which has really become my go-to material for shop tools. Its higher quality means that any tools you build with it will also be higher quality. These blocks here are the pieces that are gonna make up the main support for the sanding disc. And basically I just glued these together, shot some pin nails in them, and clamped them up and set them aside so that they could dry. And here I'm just making a really simple jig that basically attaches to my router and allows me to cut out perfect circles. I cut out some blanks for the circles and drilled a small pilot hole in the center of each one of them. Then I started cutting. The jig works by placing a small nail in the center of the blank and then rotating the router around that center point. I cut out 3 circles, one for the main face of the disc and 2 smaller supporting discs. I just quickly sanded all the edges to remove any burrs. I centered one of the smaller discs on the main disc and traced it so it would be easier to align after I applied glue. I drilled a large hole in one of the smaller discs and a 5/16 hole partially through the main disc, and then finally I drilled another 5/16 hole all the way through the other small disc. This will all make sense in a little bit. I carefully positioned the small disc with the large hole onto the large disc and then glued and nailed it in place. A couple nails came through, so I just cleaned those up with a flat file. I cut a piece of 5/16 plain steel rod. Before cutting, I examined the rod to make sure the portion I was using was perfectly straight. You can pick up a 4-foot length of steel rod like this from your local home center for about $5. I filed off the burrs and lightly polished it to remove any residue from the label. I drew marks based on the rod's position in the assembly and used those as a guide to file shapes into the end of the rod. I cut 4 long grooves near the end of the rod. And these run parallel to the length of the rod. These are what's actually going to apply the force that turns the disc, and that'll make more sense in just a bit here. Then I cut this circular groove all the way around the rod, and that's what's actually going to hold the disc to the rod. I mixed up some old school JB Weld, being careful to follow the manufacturer's instructions of mixing equal parts and mixing it very, very thoroughly. I applied just a dab to the hole the end of the rod was going to go in, just to make sure I got some in there. Then I filled the reservoir with epoxy. I placed the rod in the reservoir and made sure to put the end of the rod into the hole that was in the larger disc. I then applied a little more epoxy a little further up the rod and to the third disc. This is just to make sure that there's good epoxy contact between the third disc and the rod. I applied glue, but I was careful to leave a little bit of room to make sure the squeeze out didn't interfere with the epoxy. After that, I added the third disc to the assembly and began the process of squaring it up. So basically, the whole purpose of the third plate is to lock the rod at 90 degrees. So basically, you just pull or push the rod into a 90-degree position and fire nails through the third plate into the plate below it, and that'll lock the rod at 90 degrees while the epoxy cures. Then I clamped up the assembly and waited the 24 hours necessary for the epoxy to fully cure. In case you're wondering how the JB Weld is going to hold up, I performed many tests with a handful of readily available epoxies. I used JB Weld's Clear Weld, Gorilla Glue's 5-minute epoxy, and I even did a half-hearted test with some old school JB Weld Original that I had lying around. The JB Weld Clear Weld failed pretty easily, as did the Gorilla Glue. To my surprise, the one that did the best was the old school JB Weld. When I tried to make a hole in it, I could only make a very small indent, and it was harder to break free than all the others, even though I only used half the amount of epoxy. It didn't even cover the shapes that I filed into the end of the rod. Now, to be clear, this is the original formula that takes a really long time to cure. Based on the relative success of that first attempt, I repeated the test, this time being sure to use enough to cover the shapes I filed into the end of the rod. I was not able to break it, no matter how hard I tried, and when I tested how it would hold up against rotational torque, it didn't budge at all. The steel rod actually started to fail instead of the epoxied joint. To help me determine how high my bearings should be on the block, I just held the disc loosely in place and made sure I had enough space underneath it, and then drew a line. I then used that line to transfer the marks all the way around the block, and then I made my marks in the center where the bearings would go. I used a 7/8 inch bit to drill the holes for the bearings, and I drilled them just a little bit deeper than the depth of the bearing itself. Then I used a 5/8 inch hole to drill all the way through the block. I rounded the top corners of the bearing block before installing it, because doing so afterwards would be really tough. My bandsaw is out of commission right now, so I actually just used a coping saw and then an orbital sander to clean up any rough edges. Luckily, the 7/8 inch bit I used for this project gave me a really nice tight fit for the bearings. Again, the bearing holes are just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the bearing. This is to make sure that the plate doesn't rub up against the bearing and prevent it from turning. The disc was just slightly out of square with the base, so I added shims of paper one at a time until it was perfectly square with the base. To align the bearing block, I laid out some preliminary marks to help me center the block on the baseboard. Then, I just loosely assembled the main components to get a feel for where everything should go. This stainless steel fender washer works as a sort of a thrust washer. I placed the sharp edge towards the bearing block and the smooth edge towards the disc, since there is more wood to steel contact on the disc side of things. To actually install the bearing block, I drew some more marks to make sure I had everything where I wanted it. And then I glued the shims of paper together, glued them to the baseboard, and then glued the bearing block on top of that. Now, it was tough for me to try to get a clamp around the bearing block in this position, so I just added as many weights as I could find to it to make sure it had enough pressure for the glue to set for about 30 minutes. To finish securing it to the base, I drilled pilot holes, countersinks, and added screws. After that, I checked it for square one last time and then moved on to building the drill platform. The drill platform basically consists of a way to hold a drill and a way to control the speed of the drill. The hole I'm chopping here is just to allow a hose clamp to secure the drill in place, which you'll see in just a bit. I cut this small block, then drilled and threaded a hole in it. It's going to be used to control the drill speed, and it's going to be placed right in front of the drill's trigger on the drill platform. Then I made this small block that will work as a knob for a carriage bolt. Just like the larger block, I drilled and threaded a hole in this smaller block, but then I added a carriage bolt to it. I threaded the carriage bolt in place and then used a washer and a hex nut to compress the square neck of the carriage bolt into the knob. And the pressure between the square neck of the carriage bolt and the wood is enough to hold it in place. Off camera, I assembled the drill platform, including adding the trigger block. Then I partially disassembled the platform to make it easier to install this hose clamp. After everything is assembled, the hose clamp quickly and easily secures the drill in place. The drive shaft was still oversized at this point, so I sized it up and cut it down to the appropriate length. And here I'm just filing down the end to remove any burrs. To make sure the platform was in just the right spot, I actually attached it to the drive shaft and then fired some pin nails to hold it in place. The pin nails will hold it in place, but not very securely, so I very carefully disassembled it and then clamped the drill platform down to make sure it wasn't going to move, and then I secured it the rest of the way with screws. And of course, I was sure to drill pilot holes and countersinks before each screw I added. I did a dry assembly of the table components and made a mark where I could drill a dust collection port. After adding the dust collection hole, I finished assembling the table components. The table components double as the dust collection area, but I still needed to enclose around the disc to ensure there would be enough suction. I used the scraps that came from cutting the disc since they were already pretty close to the right shape. They weren't quite big enough though, so I glued some other scraps to them to make them just a little bit bigger. Once the glue had dried, I just held them up in place and then traced around them and cut them down to size. To actually attach them to the assembly, I just used pin nails and glue. To attach the actual tabletop, I only used screws, no glue. This is to make sure it's easier to remove later on. For finishing, I applied about 6 coats of polyurethane, being sure to sand and blow off the dust with compressed air in between every coat. After curing, the polyurethane finish makes an excellent surface for applying adhesive sandpaper discs. And yes, the discs are also easy to remove. This electrical box will work as the on-off switch for the sander. This shot is a little bit out of sequence, but I'm showing it here just to show you that I added wax to the thrust washer just to give it some lubrication. Then I added these rubber feet just to make sure the sander has plenty of grip when it's sitting on the workbench. This gap at the front of the sander allows you to easily clamp it to a workbench. I'm really happy with the performance of this third design. The dust collection is nearly perfect, almost no dust gets out whatsoever, and there's hardly any wobble at all. So the first 2 designs used a thread and a hex nut to attach the disc to the drive shaft, and that made it to where it was really difficult to get the drive shaft at a perfect 90 degrees. However, with this one, using JB Weld, I was able to get the drive shaft at a perfect 90 degrees, and so again, this machine has virtually no wobble and it's just buttery smooth to use. Again, I really don't think I could be any happier with it at this point. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you liked this video. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and check out all my other cool videos. I'd love to hear what you think about this project in the comments section below. And if you have any quick questions you want answered, hit me up on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And until the next time I see you, I hope you have fun building something.